Welcome, Wargamers! Welcome back to the channel. Today we have a little treat. We are going to do a couple of things at the same time. First of all, we are going to review and evaluate and do kind of a deep dive into the mass combat system for the Conan 2d20 game system, the RPG. At the same time, the scenario we're going to use is provided by Mr. Wargaming over at the Joy of Wargaming channel, which I highly encourage you to check out if you haven't already, who has put together a scenario he actually put it out for all sorts of people to take a look at it and play it out in any system they saw fit. He calls it a proof of concept idea. I'm not sure what he's going to do with it. I'm sure he's got a video coming soon, and I look forward to that. But in any case, this is how we handled it. The scenario being a group of prisoners being escorted by 125 orcs, and these orcs are about to be intercepted by a group of 160 cavalry led by a hero by the name of Sir Dude Delabides. So, without further ado, we are going to take a look at this, we being myself and Russagos the Scholar, the RPG Sage, and we'll be looking at how to set this all up using the Conan 2d20 system, and then we will lay out the battle. Without further ado, let's get down to business and see how this system works.
I guess the first thing we should talk about is that the mass combat system uses all three levels of war. There's the tactical, the operational, and the strategic level of war. Tactical is what do you do on the ground? Who do you shoot? When do you hit them? Where do you stand to do these things? The operational level is how do you maneuver your forces? How do you command larger groups to move and attack? And why are you attacking from this direction or that direction, or with this force or that force? Finally, the strategic level of war is what do you ultimately hope to accomplish? What is your end goal? Work backward from there, and what are all of the intermediary steps and goals which must be accomplished to achieve that goal? So 2d20 encompasses all of that. The supplement Conan the King, starting on page 102, has a section on warfare, how to organize your forces from the kingdom down. So how do you muster troops? How do you issue orders to them? How do you maneuver them around? How do you control them? How do you set up coalitions to share power? It's like 4 pages. It's very rules light, but it provides the framework of how to address domain versus domain warfare, particularly against either other players or DM-controlled NPCs that the enemies or the players would be fighting. They eventually become kings by their own hand, as Conan once said, and now they're going off and waging civilizational war. Well, the Conan the King book has 4 pages of rules on how to raise units, maneuver them, and control them. But that's not directly applicable to the actual mass combat role.
That is great information, though, and it gives me an impetus to do some more study into how this could be implemented in an actual campaign. And perhaps I'm not going to give it the full service that it deserves simply in trying to let's bang out a battle and see how it works, in the context of, or without context, really. But yeah, that's the intention of this series of videos, is to almost to isolate the mass combat system from the greater system in order to analyze the essential pieces that make it work. Because my goal with this is to see what tools work, what tools don't, what might be window dressing, and what could be combined into a single system that can be used in any rule set, implementing mass combats that arise during play, or even that might be scheduled, if you will, because of a domain event or a campaign level event that Game Master might have in mind for the future. And sometimes these things can take place off screen as well, so the dungeon master can run it by themselves or with a patron.
Right. To that end, I think that the mass combat rules in 2d20 are fit to purpose. I think that they do, in fact, address the need to resolve a mass combat situation that occurs organically during play without having to stop and break out the minis, which, as a sidebar, is one of my biggest frustrations with wargaming rules. It appears obvious to me that the 2d20 system inherits from the mass combat system present in present in Fantasy Flight Games, Star Wars RPG, and their generic Genesis or narrative dice system engine, in that it is a mass combat check made using your leadership against the enemy leadership with mitigating factors, and the overall success or failure of each round of mass combat should not be the overall success or failure of the battle, but rather progress toward accomplishing a goal. So if the point of the mass combat is we have a bunch of cavalry who are going to come and break out these prisoners, then the step on that is not, step one, rescue the prisoners. It's more like step one, successfully ambush the orcs. Step two, scatter the orcs to get them away from the prisoners. Step three, get a sneak force up to liberate the prisoners. Step four, either arm the prisoners or get them out. And then step five, withdraw in good order. Or, crush the enemy if you can.
What we want to avoid is the war machine system, where it's just a whole bunch of modifiers based on conditions, equipment, etc. And then you make one roll, and that's essentially the outcome of the whole battle.
Yes.
Because while that may appeal to some people who are just not interested in miniatures at all, I think that you can add a little more strategy, as you mentioned, and tactics to make it more fun at the table, even during, what might be a role-playing session where, suddenly a battle erupts or the battle is planned. Maybe you spent 2 or 3 sessions getting ready to. What I'm trying to do is find something that strikes a middle ground where you don't necessarily have to break out miniatures, especially in a world like today where so many people are playing online and so much more of the play is theater of the mind. Virtual tabletops aside, there's a lot of work that goes into preparing a virtual tabletop, and not going to address that in this series because that is its own creature. And if you want to create a virtual tabletop, miniatures replacement game, that's probably a great idea.
Well, in
What
one
I'm
way,
looking
virtual
for,
tabletops have made miniatures play even more accessible than ever before, because now you don't need $10,000 worth of minis, and you don't need a huge play area in somebody's house or basement in order to spread out terrain and pieces. You don't need measuring sticks or plotter's rods or anything else. You just hop onto your computer. DM loads up a virtual tabletop where all the terrain is imaginary and all the minis are tokens that can be infinitely created and infinitely destroyed, and allows you to enact sort of the ideal tabletop war game over the internet, although without any of the tactility or joy of touching things.
which admittedly for my own enjoyment of the game is definitely a part of it. It is more than a game, it's a hobby, when it comes to miniature gaming. And for most of my miniature gaming career, which is like half my life now, the hobby part of it is really actually more rewarding, if you will. I like sitting down and painting miniatures. I think it's cool. There is a new skill set that, yes, I do need to learn in order to create virtual tabletops and be able to execute these things. We're going off on a tangent. So let's get back to Conan 2d20 and the rules and the structures that enable us to go ahead and introduce a mass combat into a play session. For the Conan 2d20 mass combat system, we are going to be executing a scenario provided by the Joy of Wargaming YouTube channel, who wanted to put out a scenario and let a bunch of people run through the scenario in different systems for a whole compare and contrast thing. I think that was the goal. He said it's for a proof of concept. I'm not sure what his deal is. He's keeping it secret, but that's okay. So, in any case, the scenario is that a group of 125 orcs are escorting a group of 525 prisoners to the north to deliver these prisoners to a giant for the giant to have a feast. The prisoners, their comrades in arms, a force of 160 light cavalry, are headed north to intercept the orcs and free the prisoner. So that's the scenario. It does include one hero, which, if you're using chainmail rules, would be a 4th level fighter. So what we did, though, is Rasagos and I put together an idea where there should be a leader for the prisoners and a leader for the orcs. We gave them some statistics for intelligence and charisma. As Rasagos will explain, those are what's used in the determination of results. So, Rasagos, if you want to go ahead and explain how you translated this scenario into the 2d20 concept, then we'll go through that and we'll lay out the situation and we'll roll some dice.
All right, I'd love to. So the first thing to consider is that in more sophisticated miniatures combat rules systems, the total composition of the force can be much more varied. You can have 20 archers and 50 spearmen and so on. And these things can be accounted for. Standard chainmails, one figure is 10 men. So you got, then 2 archers and 5 spearmen figures and so on. And you can have a much more varied force. Because the Conan 2d20 mass combat system relies so heavily on theater of the mind style play, and because it relies so heavily on the contributions of the player characters in their leadership roles, that isn't really feasible. So in Conan, a single character fighting against another character uses their own skills and defense and combat stats. And a single character can take command of up to 4 identical minions, a special class of NPC, and lead those 4 minions plus themselves as a squad. And this will be a 1 to 5, essentially, if you're thinking in chainmail terms. And that squad then acts as one unit, either fighting against other similarly organized squads on the battlefield or mobbing some important NPC to make sure that the evil sorcerer gets stabbed by somebody. And that can all be handled organically during the normal course of your play session. And importantly, it still uses the player character's attack and defense statistics. It still uses their skills. You are still rolling an attack. You're just rolling extra dice for that attack for each of your squad members. So if you have a mass combat that breaks out, even a small one, what we might consider a skirmish scale fight, you can still turn to these rules and use them to quickly adjudicate that fight without having to roll dice for every single character's action. That means that you have to have stats for the leaders of each force. Every force that is going to act in the combat must have a leader, and they have to have at least 2 stats. The Conan system has, I believe, 7 statistics, and what each combatant leader needs to have is an intelligence stat, which governs their use of the warfare skill and its associated talents. And they need to have a personality stat, which governs their use of the command skill and its associated talents. And then I guess you should probably figure out some of their weapon and attack skills, but that is kind of secondary. Because just as a single character can rope in 4 minions and say, "Come with me, men," that squad can then rally other squads of 5 fighters each and say, "Come with me, men, and we're going to form a company." So when you form a company, it's basically scaling the squad thing up. A squad has a leader and 4 minions, and a company has 1 squad, which is the vanguard, i.e. the one the leader is in, and then any number of other squads. There's no limit, as far as I know, to the number of squads in a company, although a close reading would suggest that each company should also be no more than 5 squads total. So one vanguard squad containing the leader, and then up to 4 other squads composed of men-at-arms or fighters. And if you have more than 5 squads, then the excess need to be broken off into another company. So for squads of varying compositions, do some people have heavy armor? Do some have spears? Some have bows? For it to be useful to the squad, the item must be owned by half or more of the company, which is another reason to break your forces up into smaller companies. If you've got a company of 5 squads and they all have whatever is available, then nobody gets any credit for having their special equipment. But if you have enough squads to break off and say, okay, we're going to have a short company, 3 squads of infantry, and then 2 more short companies, 2 squads of archers, and 3 squads of spearmen, then you have 3 companies fighting, which has implications for command and control, uh, but allows each company to take advantage of their special equipment.
Okay, and then just to interrupt quickly, then each of those companies would then need to have their own leader figure with a
Yes,
warfare skill and a command skill that would be relevant to the dice rolling when the battle commences.
yes, kind of. So the command skill in the mass combat determines exactly how many additional squads can be controlled as part of a character's company. So every point of focus you have in the command skill allows you to include an additional squad in your company.
Right, but if we're breaking up companies where we have X number of archers and X number of spearmen and then X number of halberdiers, then you would need 3 different leader figures, one for each of those companies. And then perhaps one of those leaders could be the overall commander of the force. Would that be correct?
Yes, although the overall commander of the force is not as important as it is in War Machine. One of the reasons why that system exists is because it is assumed that Conan 2d20 is what we might consider one of the current crop of narrative games. It's not necessarily a story game because it still has dice, but there's so much going on around the dice. The metagaming currency of fortune and doom and momentum, and the entire dice pool mechanic, just how intense and involved character creation can be, that suggests that this is not an old D&D style game. And so it might be rare that one player character is wandering off into the wilderness to raise an army and have these kinds of fights. The expectation, it feels like, is that an entire group of player characters, the party as it were, is going to be involved in this mass combat. And that's part of why each individual company commander has such a limited reach, because you were expected to break this up into giving each player and thus each character their own company to control in the upcoming struggle. But that's kind of neither here nor there.
Well, actually, I think that really strikes at the heart of what a good mass combat experience at the table would include. So that, yes, you have a party of characters, and those characters will have their henchmen. And if there is going to be a mass combat envisioned in their future, whether they're, it's domain play or faction play, whatever you want to call it, but if they've, hired a group of mercenaries and 20 of them are archers and 30 of them are light cavalry and 20 of them are halberdiers, then yeah, absolutely, you would want for each of those groups of mercenaries to be led by perhaps one of the characters, or, and I know from personal experience that this comes up, if a particular character has several henchmen and or hirelings in their own little group, they could be their own squad or company, as it were, to do a sort of special mission. And when we get to some of these other game systems, this will come up again, primarily because I actually played in a ACKS game where this came up, and it was fun. It was cool, but because the rules were all being managed on the other side of the screen, I don't know how the mechanics work. So it's interesting to see how it's being constructed and what the narrative expectation is here. So that's actually a really great point.
So doing a little bit of more focused reading, and this might be an editorial comment, but it appears to me to attack the company rolls the warfare skill of the Vanguard's leader. The attack receives teamwork dice that roll against the warfare skill of the subordinate squad leaders. So that suggests to me that while you get to add dice for each squad under your control, what you're actually doing is adding additional chances, but each squad leader needs to have their own warfare and command skills, which strikes me as being recursively involved and invested.
Well, I think that sounds reasonable in that if you have a force commander and then you have company commanders, then when company A goes to fight company one of the enemy, then those two company commanders would be the ones who provide the stats and the dice pools for the combat.
And
Because
that's,
the overall commander would probably also be a company commander of one of the companies.
yeah,
That's my interpretation of your description.
I think that's perfectly fair. So, what it's starting to look like to me is that in a squad situation, the leader uses their skills, and for each individual squad member, up to 4 identical minions, then you use their skills to determine the fight. So, if I'm looking at a guard minion or a guard sergeant toughened, then they have their own attack skills, they have their own fields of expertise, they have their own attributes. So they have an intelligence score, they have a personality score, and that's even at the minion level. So there are no enemies, no NPCs that don't have an intelligence and a personality score and a field of expertise and some kind of a skill. So particularly if you're then looking at having mass combat, then what you have is an overall leader of his squad using his skills and the squad contributing theirs. And then each squad in a company is led by its own leader. And so when a company clashes with another, then the Vanguard rolls its leader's skill, which will be the player characters. And then each separate squad in the company tests their separate leader's command or warfare skill. And then going up further, when you have more companies clashing, yes, you get to add more dice, but you're not testing all those dice against the best, warfare and command in the whole group. That's certainly one of the best reasons to improve it. But a single character who has minimaxed all of his points into warfare and command can only command so many squads. Can be in operational control of the whole fight. But this system assumes that your local leadership, to put it in parlance, your lieutenants and NCOs are going to have a much bigger contribution to the success or failure of the individual squad or company action.
Okay, so to get into the scenario example itself, if we have these, say, the 160 light cavalry, who are led by essentially a player character, so there'll be in this particular scenario just one player character leading this cavalry troop. So that would have to be broken up then into 7 companies.
Well,
So then
160 men, and you can have up to 5 men in a squad. That's 32 squads.
right, but then you could put 5 squads to make a company. So that would be 7. You'd
You
have,
can
well,
put a
you'd have,
variable amount of squads into a company based on the command skill of their leader.
so
As
there
I'm
could be even more companies. So you'd have to figure out all the different sergeants, see how
Well,
many
I mean, if you want to do
squads
it
they could
right,
do.
you could. I think if you wanted to do it as specifically and as accurately as possible, then yeah, of course you could do that. You could also just check your core rulebook and look for an appropriate uh, minion or toughened minion to serve as the leader of each one. So, for example, in the core rulebook on page 317, it's got a guard. Page 317 of the core rulebook, it has a guard minion or a guard sergeant, which is a toughened minion or toughened creature. And that's the requirement for being the leader of a squad, is that it be a toughened creature. So you could just abstract this and say, we assume that the leader of every squad in a company is a guard sergeant, and here are his statistics.
Correct. And then how many squads then would a typical toughened sergeant be able to lead? Would he be able to have the full contingent of 5 squads to form his full strength company? Or do you have to do some rolls and then like literally figure out how good all each of these sergeants are? Or is there a generic template you can just stamp and say, this is a sergeant? Because I have 160 cavalry, if I break them into squads of 5, that would be 32. So that means there's 32 sergeants, and now I have to roll 32 times to see how good their intelligence and personality are.
I don't think you have to, because there's a couple of things that are coming up here. First, for command, determines the extent to which a player character can maintain control of a larger force. While any character can be part of a squad and lead it with determination, your command focus determines how many additional squads can be controlled as the character's company. Each point of command focus allows the character to include one additional squad in their company. But that then conflicts the example. Thus, a nobleman with a command focus of 2 can lead 3 squads in their company, not 5 plus 2, which is how I would read it based on the preceding paragraph about squads.
Depending on the focus, the leadership focus of each of these sergeants would determine how many squads they could have under their control.
That's what I'm seeing. And looking at the template for a guard sergeant, it looks like he's got one rank of social expertise, basically. So that seems like command to me. So I would say that he then has command focus of 1. So he can lead 2 squads, a short company of 10 people. That doesn't make much sense to me. And further, not only does that seem very, very short for a company, um, but it also makes it difficult to standardize.
Exactly, and that's exactly where I'm going with this because I'm looking at the scenario, the concept of the mass combat that we'd like to play, and as we each time we peel back a layer to determine who can do what and how do we organize these things so we know how many dice to roll, etc. Um, seems like we're uncovering another. There's yet another layer beneath.
So
Does it sound reasonable though to say that okay, so we have let's call it 35 companies, and some of those are short. Say we have 20 full companies, right? To make 100, well, let's see, 150 would give us 30 companies, and then we could have a short company of 4 and 2 short companies of 3. So that would be 30. We could do 33 companies then,
I
where
think
2 of them are 4
I
and
think
2 of them
I
are,
think
one of them is
you've
3.
backed off a little bit, because if we've got 160 men in the cav force, no more than 5 people can be in a squad, so that's 32 squads. And here, I think we need to decide right now: are we going to run this combat rules as written, even when they become complicated and make no sense, or are we going to look at trying to make changes? So rules as
No,
written.
this is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out where do these rules break down, and is it possible? Because I'm thinking that this is a fun scenario, and if I were to take this scenario and apply it to every different mass combat system that I have in mind, um, this could show some, it would give us definitely an apples to apples comparison for each system because it's starting to look like we're just trying to get this set up, and X had, Sir Dude Delabides has 160 light cavalry with him, and now we're struggling to figure out how to divide them up into companies, and then even know how many, so how many dice do we roll when these horsemen get in contact with the orcs?
So what I would suggest is that, without bothering to go through and stat out literally every single person, we could take a template from the core rulebook and say, let's assume that Sir Dude Delabides has guards and guard sergeants. So the guard sergeant has a social focus of 2. So his command becomes 2. So he can lead. I'm sorry, a social focus of 1. So his command becomes 1. So he can lead 2 squads out of the 32 available. So any sergeant can lead 2 squads. So let's look at that.
That would give us then 80 companies.
16 companies.
2 squads is 10, so there were 16 companies then.
Yeah. 160 men, 5 men per squad.
Okay,
That's 32 squads.
Gotcha.
With regular, ordinary sergeants as your NCOs, each sergeant can control 2 squads. So that's 16 companies, each of 2 squads. And then the way that combat works is it breaks by company. So when you're attacking with a character, it's each character. When you're attacking as the leader of a squad, each squad acts. When you're attacking as the leader of a company, in this case, 10 men is a company, okay? Then each company acts, and then each company needs to roll their command and warfare against the other guy.
So if we were to assume a standard average score of 7,
Yes.
then each company would roll 2 dice and need to get a 7 or less in order to have a success.
Well, let's back up a step. Okay, so now we've got 16 companies, each being led by a sergeant. I'm looking at the stats here, and it says a sergeant's intelligence is 7, and he's got 1 field of combat expertise. So 7 plus 1 is 8. So his warfare skill is going to be 8 or less, and his personality score is 8. His social focus is 1. So his command skill target number is going to be 9. So what he's going to do is he's going to roll when that company under that sergeant is making that attack. The sergeant is going to roll 2d20s against his warfare skill, and he's going to try to get under an 8 on either or both of those.
Okay. So then what effectively, if we were to just throw this out there and try to do this all at once, you'd roll 32 dice trying to get a 1 through 7 on each score for a
Right.
success.
And then each die that is under that is a success. And then every die that is a 1 is a double success. So a critical success. And then we have to then start looking at the difficulty of the check. So let's say that the scenario is that we have 160 light cav with studded leather, shield, lance, mace, led by a hero, chainmail, lance, sword, versus 125 orcs in chainmail, no shields, and half of them have spears and throwing axes. 20% have crossbows, 30% have pole arms. So what we might do is say, okay, so our light cavalry force is 16 companies that are all identical, and that's it. And then for the orcs, we might say, what is it, 62 of them are
Well,
chainmail.
let's break that up. Let's break that up so that there's 125, which would be 25 companies,
25 squads.
25 squads. I'm sorry. So let's
And
call
let's assume that the orcs are exactly as competent as the humans. So that's 12 full strength companies of 2 squads each, and 1 extra squad. Now maybe that one gets attached to the orc leader.
So
Because
let's say that there are 12 squads.
12 companies, one of which is reinforced.
Well, there'll be 25. 125 orcs makes 25 squads, correct?
Yes. And then if
So
each squad needs.
let's break this up then. So 12 of those squads will have spear and throwing axe, and then we'll say that of the 13 remaining, that 6 of those will have crossbows. Say 5. 5 squads have crossbow and short sword. That leaves 17, which means there's 8 left. So 8 squads will be on with pole. That takes away the 62. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And we should be, in fact, putting this in terms of the squads and companies. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the composition of forces then begins to matter significantly. For instance, looking at our example guard sergeant with 1 rank of combat and 1 rank of social, that gives him very mediocre success chances in battle. Contrarily, if we're looking at knights, elite fighters, then not only do they have better intelligence and personality scores, but then they have more focus in combat and social.
Correct. Correct. And in a potentially in a different scenario, that could have, that would swing the results immensely. Absolutely.
Yes, which is one strength of the system. Once you've got it broken out like this, and you're actually looking at who's in charge of each force and applying their modifiers, then I think it will provide some verisimilitude. 11 companies have 2 squads. The 12th company has 3, and that'll be the leader's squad.
So that'll be 12 squads with spear and throwing axe.
Yes, there we go. 6 companies with spear and throwing axe.
And then we have 5 squads with crossbows and short swords. So that'll be 3 companies.
Yes. He has a very impressive charisma. We would translate that to very impressive personality. Or perhaps we might say that he has average personality but strong command, which would increase the number of squads he has under his control. So you could say, aha, those with the crossbows and short swords, those are obviously the elite guard of the orc chieftain.
Yeah. Well, would he be able to control then 5 squads by
I mean, it
himself?
would depend on his actual stats, but you gave me essentially charisma 16, and I
I
might
mean, if he had
translate
if
it.
he had personality 16, I mean that's or would
I
that
mean, that's like incredibly superhuman. Stats in Conan for human type characters generally run from 6 to 12,
okay?
and at
So that
no
would
point,
say let's call that an 11
yeah.
personality.
So that just means that his attempts to command would be more likely to succeed, and then his actual command skill ranks will determine how many extra squads he can control.
So with a
High personality
personality of
means
11, how
he can
many how
control
many
them very well.
how many squads would he be able to control?
Well, as I said, with personality 11, he can only control 1 squad, but he's going to control it really well. But it depends on his command skill points. So if we assume that he has the same command skills as like a knight, then we might say that his total command skill is 12, and he's got 2 points of focus in that. So he personally can control 3 squads because he's a hideous orc, but he rules through fear and intimidation. So we might say he's got average personality but uh, high command. And this is one of the downfalls of trying to translate between systems. But I would say
Oh no,
that for an,
absolutely. And that
an
but that's that
exciting
that
fight,
is helping us to figure this out. So that's where this is exciting. So that
I would say that for an exciting
so
fight, I personally would rule that the orc chieftain does not have very great personality. I mean, let's say an average of 8, but he would then have 3 or even 4 points of command because he's obviously worked his way to the top and forced himself to excel. So he personally could control, 3, 4, or even 5 squads.
all right, well let's assume then that the orc commander can control 4 squads. And we'll put
Okay,
him with the pole arms. We'll put him with the pole arms. So there'll be an orc commander with 1 company of 4, and then we'll have 2 companies of 2. So there'll be 3 companies of pole arms, but 1 will be 4 squads strong, including the commander.
that's how I would do it.
Oh, okay. So now we've got that. So we've got 6 companies, each of 2 squads of spear and axe. We have 3 companies, either 2 squads or 1 squad of short sword and crossbow. And then we have 3 companies, pole arms. 1 is a double strength company, and the other 2 are 2 squads. So that gives us 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's 12 companies, 11 of which will have the same warfare and command skill. because we're going to use a template. Then
Yes.
the 12th will have a different warfare and command core. And then if we look at the horseman, he's just going to be, with his average personality score, he's going to just command the 2 squads. So there will be 16 companies of 2 squads, each led by a sergeant, with essentially all of those companies will have the same warfare and command scores.
Yes. No, I'm looking at the hero who's got slightly higher than average intelligence. We might reflect that as either a higher intelligence, making his warfare command tests more likely to succeed, or we might represent that as an average intelligence with a higher warfare and command or warfare focus or expertise, basically the ranks in the warfare skill.
Okay, so then we could say that there are 15 with a warfare of 8 and 1 with a warfare of 9. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
And then likewise with the orcs, we'll have 11 times the warfare 8, because that's the average.
Mhm.
And there'll be 1 significantly more, which would probably be 10. That's
Yeah, that would be how I would put it. 10, 11, maybe even 12, depending on how many. If we're
well,
saying that
he's
the,
got the 4 squads, so let's call it 11, because that's 1 shy of max. Do we have enough information to
I
try
believe
to do
so.
this model?
I believe so. Okay.
So there are more companies of cavalry. And if we were to say that the crossbow perhaps be function, those would be engaged each by a company of cavalry, and then it would be some of the others that would also be engaged. So you'd have the 3 companies of crossbowmen as outriders, and then the polearm dudes and the spear and axe dudes are the ones actually doing the guarding. So they would have to form up. And if we were to imagine that half of them would be on one side and half of them would be on the other, then perhaps the cavalry, if they don't split up, would have 16 companies attacking only.
So what I see here is that you would then have every, you'd have what, 13 versus 13?
The hero, I'm drawing a picture.
We'll need that for later. But what I'm seeing here is that they don't have to sit out. They just basically
There,
get a second attack.
right, but there are 6 companies of orcs with spear and axe. So we'll put 3 on either side of the mob of prisoners. And at the 4 will be the long company of polearms with the commander, and then 2 additional companies, polearms. Let's say they are bringing up the rear. And then the crossbow would be outriders. We'll put 1 on either farther out on either flank and 1 more out in the front as a plank. Send you a picture of this so you can see what I'm getting at. Because here, I mean, tactics, even though we're doing theater of the mind, we still want to have a tactical viewpoint. So in this image, the squares are the spear and axe, the triangles are the pole arms, and the circles are the crossbows.
Okay. So that looks good to me. So what we would then have is first 3 companies of cavalry engaging the crossbows in their outrider position. So that's 3 one-on-one tests. 9 companies left guarding the prisoners to be engaged by 13 companies of cavalry. So that means that there are 3 extra companies of cavalry, or sorry, 4 extra companies of cavalry to assign wherever you want. And then they get a second attack from those. Or rather, there would be a second test of attack versus defense from these other companies. Does that make sense?
Okay, so yeah, so then we had.
Outnumbering your foe means you get to make more tests against them.
Gotcha. So there are 16. So let's put the commander here against the larger. The revised map will look like this, where each rectangle with a slash is a cavalry unit. The
Excellent.
rectangle with the X is the cavalry unit with the commander. The doubled triangle is the
And this is perfect
full
because
arm commander.
per the guidance in Chainmail, if 2 heroes meet each other on the battlefield, they should seek combat amongst themselves.
Correct.
So
And
this
then
makes
and then
perfect sense to me.
that's more cinematic. and in the spirit of the game anyway. So that's perfect.
Absolutely. Conan would not harass the edges of the fight. He'd go straight to the center.
Correct. Cavalry are all two squad companies, and then that particular company of pole arms is four squads. Then they'll want to try to outnumber them, in addition to the fact that the commander is there.
Right. Now, one of the things that I like about the Conan system is that outnumbering your enemy does not necessarily create a decisive advantage. It creates more opportunity for success. The orc leader's company of his reinforced company is going to be able to roll more dice in each defense or attack than the others will. Than the either any of the other companies of orcs or the light cav that are coming to harass. They'll be able to roll more dice, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be successes.
So we can go ahead and start rolling off dice then. Do we
So
want to? So we'll, and you said, like you said, we'll roll for each particular conflict.
yes,
Okay, so let me.
each particular matchup needs to be diced for.
Okay, so this will give us 12 matchups. 1, 2, and 3 will be crossbow versus cavalry. Number 4 will be polearm orc polearm company with commander versus human cavalry commander and two additional companies. And then 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12 will all be spear orc spearmen versus cavalry. And then 8 and 9 will both be orc polearms versus two companies of cavalry.
Okay, so just looking at the modifiers here, when the cavalry attacks, it begins as a simple test, which is difficulty 0. They are attacking people who have heavy armor, chainmail, but not plate, and they are attacking with mounts for a total difficulty of 1. The defenders start at a difficulty of 3. They reduce that by longer reach weapons. And that's it. So their difficulty is 2. So for each cav attack, they are rolling 2d20 for the leader. And we had said previously that the cav sergeants, did we write that down? Were we smart enough to write this down earlier?
They have a warfare of 8.
Warfare 8, command 9.
Command 9. Yep.
And then orc Tuffy, whatever we want to call their NCOs.
The orcs will have they'll be the same. Warfare 8, command 9, and then the orc leader, your commander, will have a warfare of 11 and a command of 12.
And the hero.
Whereas the hero will have warfare 9, command 10.
Okay. So this is already tilting the odds in favor of the orcs. Even though there are more horsemen, and even though they are in a better attack position, when it comes time to defeat the orc leader, his better warfare and command skills are going to tip the odds in his favor by 20% combined. Okay, but let's roll some dice. So for each of the, fight 1, 2, and 3, fight 1 is 1 cav versus 1 crossbow.
So that'll be 2 dice, and we'll need 8s or less, correct?
Roll 2d20 against a target number of 8.
Yeah. So we got a 1 and a 4.
Okay, now in this case, because of the way that the Conan skill system works, if the number you roll on your die is less than your focus, it counts as a double success. So they have a focus of 1, so that's actually 3 successes. And they needed 1, so that's success with 2 momentum. The extra successes become momentum. So it's a success plus 2. Now the orcs have to defend. So the orcs roll 2d20, and then any success underneath the warfare score of the attackers, so in this case an 8, is going to be a success. When you get to 2 successes, that's you succeeded at the attack. Every extra success becomes momentum, which is a metagame currency that you can spend to affect outcomes or make things more likely. But for now, we roll the 3d20, and we've got a 1, a 4, a 4. So in Conan, if you roll underneath your target number, it's a success. If it is also underneath your focus number, it's a double success, like a crit. So that 1 is the focus number of these guards. So that's 2 successes, plus 1, plus 2. So that's success plus 3. And now the orcs have to defend. So now they're going to roll. And they are also, I think, the same, right? They're 2 squads.
Correct.
Okay. So they're going to roll 3d20, 2 for the vanguard and 1 for the assistant squad. And they are rolling their command skill. So their command on the orcs is 9. Okay, so I rolled a 4. I'm sorry, I rolled 3d20 and I got 11, 8, and 12 against a total of 9. So that's only 1 success. They needed 2, so they failed. The attackers win the struggle. They deal 1 casualty to the defenders immediately, plus 1 extra casualty per momentum. So they had success, which kills or disbands or routs or wounds or however you want to narrate it. It doesn't necessarily mean slaughtered in the streets, although it could. They remove 1 squad immediately and up to 3 additional squads because of their momentum. So we're looking at a company here, or 2 companies. I'm sorry, a company of 2 squads. So that is a complete and total success.
And then we would roll that out for the remaining 8 combats
Yes.
that are the same way. Now, for combat number 4, that will be the commander will get 2d20 for himself, plus 3d20 for each squad that he's leading.
So when it comes time
There
for
are 4
the
squads.
leaders to fight, the leaders will roll 2d20 for themselves. And then they add 1d20 for each additional squad under their control. The cavalry leader is just a
Will
regular
be
2
2d20
squad. Yep.
plus
Plus 1 for
2
3.
plus 1d20
Yeah.
for his squad.
The leader gets 2
And,
d20, and then because he has a second squad in his company, that gives him a third d20.
and
The
then there
orc,
are
on the
2
other hand,
additional companies. There are 2 additional companies of 2 squads in that battle. So do
will
they?
resolve them separately.
Okay, so they don't. We're not going to. So it doesn't become one big pile on.
No, it's 3 chances for them to succeed, and 3 times that the defender has to succeed.
So then, for each of the additional companies, it will be 2d20 plus 1.
Each company of 2 squads is 3d20s. Now here we might have to change the modifiers though,
Because
because
the 3d20 for the cavalry commander, that's for 9 or less, and the other 2 are 8 or less.
yes.
Right? And then for the orc defenders, it will be the orc commander with 4 squads in his company, so that'll be 5d20 at a 12 or less.
Yeah, so let's roll for this. So we've got 3d20s for the cavalry commander, 2 for himself and 1 for his extra company, against his warfare of, I wrote this down, 9, because he's the one directly making this attack.
Right, so it would be 3d20 at 9 or less, and then
Okay.
3d20 at 8 or less, and 3d20 at 8 or less.
So he got 19, 8, and 18. So that's 1 success, which is enough. The cavalry succeed on a D1. So he got 1 success. That's enough. Now the orc has to defend. So he's going to roll 2d20 for himself, plus 1d20 for each additional squad he has under him.
And he needs 12.
Yes. So 5 d20s against the orc command of 12. So he got a 19, 10, 8, 8, 2. And that 2 is under his focus, so that's a double. So that's 2, 3, 4, 5 successes. So the attackers succeeded on the attack, but the defenders succeeded on the defense, and the relative balance of successes favors the defenders because they had more momentum. So in this, they can immediately counterattack. First, because the defenders won the contest, they do not suffer any casualties. They don't inflict casualties on the attackers, but they don't suffer any. Next, they can choose to spend their momentum. They can either spend the momentum to decrease the difficulty of their next attack, or they can immediately counterattack right now by spending 3 momentum. And this basically gives them a free attack this round instead of having to wait for their round to act.
And so their attack will then be 5d20 at an 11 minus. And the commander of the cavalry, his company's defense will be 3d20 at 10 minus. Right?
Or fair. Yeah, if they spend their momentum to counterattack now, which I would recommend that they do,
Yeah.
then
Absolutely.
they're going to make a warfare test against 11, and then the cavalry commander is going to defend by rolling 3d20 against him of 10. Okay, so when I dice that out, I see that the orc succeeded on all of his attacks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 successes, and one of those that might be as many as 7 successes if the threes are under his expertise for warfare, which I don't remember off the top of my head if his warfare was 3 or better. I thought it was 2.
I think it was 2 because we pumped up his command so he could have more squads.
Right. Okay, so that's 5 successes on his attack. And the cavalry defended with an 8, a 4, and a 1, which is definitely under the expertise, so that's a double. So that's 5 successes versus 4. The orcs needed, when they are attacking, the defenders have shields, so they need success 1. The defender has mounts, they need success 2. The defender has light armor, leather, that's success 3. So they needed 3 successes in order to get a hit at all, which they got, 1, 2, 3, with either 2, I think 2 momentum. So success plus 2 versus on the defense, the cavalry have no modifiers whatsoever because they don't have longer reach, they don't have cover, they don't have fortifications, and their armor and mounts are accounted for in the attack modifiers. So they need to make a daunting or 3. So they need 3 successes to accomplish, which they do. 1, 2, 3, 4. But theirs is only success plus 1. So the balance of momentum is slightly in favor of the attacker, of the
Right.
orcs.
They have
So
5 successes, so they have success plus 2, and the cavalry have 4 successes, so they have success plus 1.
yes, and that leads to a situation where because the attack succeeds, they deal 1 casualty to the defenders, removing the weakest squad, and they have 1 extra momentum to spend, so they could remove another squad from that.
Awesome. So theoretically, they didn't win, or
You could start penalizing for that, but none of that is in the rules as written. So rules as written, yeah, it could be that 3 companies of horsemen keep attacking and keep getting repulsed by counterattacks.
now that I
Okay.
understand how this works. So the interesting thing is, while on paper you start to look at this and say, "Oh, looks like it's pretty basic." You just roll for company versus company. Once you spread out your tactics and you make an actual battle map and turn it into a miniatures game, as it were, it gets pretty granular.
Yes. And ideally, you would have all this stuff figured out. So the DM would say, okay, the orcs are this, and here's his intelligence. Or, here's all of his stats in case that matters. And then here's his focus for command and social or commanded warfare. And that's going to be true for everybody else. Maybe he's an exemplary commander and he's got all these great skills, but he's leading perfectly ordinary orcs whose command and focus are 1. Sorry, command and warfare are 1 each. As they are in our example, where it's perfectly ordinary human versus perfectly ordinary orc and seeing what happens. And in this case, the tactical superiority that the cavalry has achieved in terms of being mounted and one, the operational advantage of moving first grants them a much better position, and then being mounted with decent armor against people who are dismounted and may have longer reach weapons but don't have the best armor. The balance of success here, they only need 1 to succeed on their attack. The orcs need to defend with 2, so that it favors the humans eventually. So what might happen is that as we dice for each of these company versus company struggles, and as we resolve the ones that are multiples, then what we're probably going to see is the orc forces get quickly cut down, and the numerical advantage is going to shift toward the humans, which will pile up more companies on top of the orc.
when this first round of combat is done, or even before it's done, when do you check? Is there a morale mechanic? Do these cavalry and or orcs, do they need to check a morale, make a morale check based on a commander just died? Do they make a morale check right now? Because in several other war game types, when the commander is taken out, that's an immediate morale check for that force. Or do we resolve all these combats and then do a morale check based on the total situation? Or is there even a morale check? Because I
There
couldn't
is
find
there is no
couldn't
morale
find
check in
that
the
rule.
rules.
Okay.
So there's a couple of ways to handle this. First, you could, as the DM, rule that the player character has to seek one-on-one combat with the orc, or that that you have to at least try, and that we want to do that first in the battle. So the cavalry leader clashes with the orc leader, and his unit was destroyed. Now, it is not stated in these rules, but it is generally considered bad form to kill a player character as a result of mass combat checks. So how I would narrate that is the cavalry charges in intending to get the orc. The ferocity of his counterattack is too much and it scatters all of the cavalry leader's guards and leaves him to face the orc alone. And then I would break their fight as a single man versus man combat using the ordinary man versus man rules, and thus allowing the leader to take advantage of all of his character skills and abilities, not just his ability at warfare.
Right. Everything that's on his character sheet.
Yeah, to use all of those in combat against the orc.
Right. Mono a orco.
Precisely. Mono a porco? Are these big face orcs?
All right. Awesome. Because I will be honest, I went into this morning with a very negative view of how this was going to work out because from the difficulty of finding these rules and interpreting them in the books, and I said this yesterday, these books really look like they were written by lawyers or people that write, the laws for Congress. This is going to happen, see page 24, and this is going to happen, see this other book on page 300 or whatever. And so there's a lot of referring back and forth to other things. And you have to, I mean, even with searchable PDF,
It's definitely a headache.
it was not easy. And I spent well over an hour trying to figure out the basics of how to set these up. And at no point in that research was it pointed out to me that you square off like this in a unit versus unit thing and then roll. To my understanding, that's why I was so amazed and I was having trouble understanding how many companies. I'm like 16 companies. Wow. So now you're going to roll 20d20 to resolve this combat. And then the other thing that I struggled with, and I spent at least 40 minutes looking for, was for morale rules. I'm like, what happens if someone dies? What happens when there's all these casualties? Where where are the morale rules and what are they called? And there aren't any. That's
To the best of my, and I'll put in a bunch of weasel words here. To the best of my understanding, there are no explicit rules for morale.
right, because neither of us are pretending to be an expert here.
Well, I'm pretending to be an expert.
Well, I'm certainly not, because I'm just looking for, getting a basic understanding of how this is supposed to work, kind of a demo, as it were. And so this definitely has turned out to be much more wargamey than I was expecting, which I like. I like that. That is a positive. The negative, of course, is that it turns into almost a PC versus PC style battle where we have a grand total of 12 different combats that need to be worked out. So the speed of this system is not great. However, the granularity is pretty good. So there's definitely something to be said for it.
Sure.
Awesome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and finish rolling these out. And since there's no morale, what other kind of quirks or foibles do you think we should address?
Well, the first one is obviously the stratagem spend. Defenders who win the struggle can spend their momentum to bank them to the pool, and those can count as future momentum later. Each player character also has access to a fortune pool, which they can spend fortune to just get success. And the DM can do the same thing with his doom pool. And there's this back and forth mechanic of when the DM spends doom points, then it increases the fortune of the players, and when the players want to accomplish things, that they don't have the fortune to pay for personally. They can give doom to the DM, so that there's this constant back and forth flow of this metagame currency, and the momentum contributes to that. The two key spends for momentum, though, are either slog. Defenders can spend momentum to reduce the difficulty of their next attack, or counterattack. They can counterattack immediately. And since there's nothing in the rules to prevent it, you could say that they can counterattack if they get at least 3 momentum on any defense. So that Orc Chieftain could just cut his way through all 3 companies of horsemen. And again, if we did that, then I, as the DM, would want to say, okay, great, now it's a one-on-one fight between you and the Orc Chieftain, because Conan is a very narrative game.
And frankly, I would think that a skilled game master would apply that particular ruling to any system, because that's the heroic nature of it. That's my opinion. So just a quick thing though, for the counterattack, it costs 3 momentum points in order to do a counterattack. So if you have success plus 2 momentum, you wouldn't be able to do.
Correct. If you didn't get at least 3 momentum on your defense, then you cannot counterattack that time. They're attacking you, and you hold them off, and then you turn around and counter. Your next round attack is going to be improved in that way.
If you were able to win,
yes, if as the defender you are able to defend,
achieve the successes that you needed.
Yes, yeah, and that's one of the things that makes this system, as you said, somewhat complicated, is that it does have different success criteria for leaders and subordinate leaders, different success criteria for attack and defense, different success criteria for the leader versus his subordinates. What if we'd had a troop of knights and we had dispersed those knights into leadership positions at each of these companies? Then the vanguard roll, the original 2d20 for each company, would be against a different target number than the support, the assistance roll for the other squads. If we had a knight whose warfare was 10 being supported by sergeants whose warfare is 8, then the knight succeeds on a 10 or less and gets a success for it. And the assistance dice he gets from the other squads under his control only count if they're 8 or less.
Okay, so just to clear this up then, if there is a company, for instance, each of these cavalry companies on this map, they are 2 squads. So when you do the attack, the first squad
gets 2d20 for itself.
It's 2d20 for itself, and then there's 1 additional support, but that's all rolled under the sergeant's.
In this case, because all of the leaders are the same, the success numbers are the same. If we had instead a knight leading a group of troops and then sergeants leading the others, so if instead we had 1 company with 1 knight, warfare 10, command 10, and then 2 sergeants, warfare 8, command 9, then what we'd be seeing is a total of 2d20 for the knight, plus up to 2d20, or plus 2d20 for the 2 squads. But the knight's success number is going to be his warfare or command.
So what happens is, instead of you wouldn't call it 5d20, you'd call it 2d20 at X and then 2d20 at Y.
Right.
Okay, so the knight gets 5d20 because he's got the 3 additional squads at his X, and then you go back and do those squads again under the sergeant's number. But what you do is you split that.
Yeah, you split it.
You have 2 dice pools rather
right.
than 1, because there are different target numbers.
And that also kind of, I believe that this is in service of the goal of having the players be the command roles for your army, that ideally you would disperse the player characters through here, and that way they're making tests against their own skills and getting support success from the subordinate leaders' skills. For simplicity, you could certainly just assert that these are all soldiers trained to the same general standard, and these are the leaders who are all trained to the same general standard, and therefore we only have 1 dice pool, and that's it. And that can work just fine.
Right, and that would be the wargaming thing to do, especially with the constraints of this particular scenario.
Yes. There's no narrative reason to suggest that the orcs are individually differentiated enough for it to matter. Ditto the humans. There's no narrative reason to suggest that.
At the heart of it, that is the entire point of having a mass combat system, is to streamline so that we're not rolling. I mean, literally, in a 2d20 system, we're not rolling 320 dice for the cavalry and 250 dice for the orcs in order to have these combats, you know, and theoretically, two at a time, two versus two at a time, so you're looking at 285 die rolls, opposed die rolls.
Yeah, no, that's no good.
All right, so that looks cool. That
So
looks
if I
good.
can offer some final considerations, what it looks like is that this system scales or distributes the leadership abilities, the leader's abilities, down to the people under his direct command, with a caveat that he still has to contend with subordinate leadership. And if the subordinate leadership is great, as in he's leading a force of all elite trained knights, then their skills are going to be great, as you would expect. And if he's leading a group of average soldiers, their skills are going to be average. And while he personally can contribute to that, particularly if the vanguard leader is a player character with access to fortune and all of the other skills available to him, then that's great. He can significantly contribute to getting the two or three successes needed to succeed on that attack, and not have to rely over much on his allies' assistance other than as damage sponges. The other thing I see is that this seems to be quite clearly inheriting from Chainmail's 1 to 5, 1 to 10 conceit. Less 1 to 20 because it, as you said, once you start breaking the combatants out into companies and looking at how many they can actually control, then it became what, 12, 16 individual fights to resolve.
Right. Yeah, we have 12 individual combats here to
Yeah.
resolve.
But I think in practice, once you're familiar with it, it'll go quickly. Roll a couple of d20s, check for
Yeah,
successes.
absolutely, absolutely, and of course the familiarity speeds things up. The first time you do anything, it takes 2 hours, and the next time it takes 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So in this case, I think we're going to see exactly that. And then what can we expect from the system going forward? Because there's no morale, it's probably going to be up to the DM to decide when the monsters flee because it makes logical sense, or because the players have accumulated enough fortune to force them to retreat, or the DM spends doom to scatter some of the players' forces that then can't be rallied. Because there are so many ways to affect the game, it's difficult to predict in advance how such a fight might go, which is exciting. You kind of have to dice for it.
Right, absolutely, and because, as you said, this is designed to be more of a narrative game. That lack of the morale rule mechanizes that and forces you to come up with a narrative solution to what happens when you know 6 of the 12 orc companies have been neutralized.
Which I think is what's likely to happen. And then you'd then have the prisoners free to escape. I don't see that it's being very likely that the humans could defeat the orc chieftain, especially having lost their commander. I don't see that, or lost his company, let's say, because we don't kill player characters off screen. So we might then break this out as the orc leader is now no longer leading his company because he's engaged in mono a porco combat with the hero, and we're going to resolve that separately. And then that's going to weaken his company, which will break up and make it easier for the humans to defeat.
At this point in the conversation, we actually had a small technical malfunction, and the last couple minutes of banter were lost. However, for the game purposes, I did go ahead and complete rolling out for the various cavalry versus orc battles, and in the end, the cavalry lost a total of 40 men. The orcs lost a total of 70. And in the mano a mano battle between the hero and the orc chieftain, the hero was able to defeat the orc chieftain. When the orc chieftain fell, the rest of the orcs fled the scene, and the prisoners were all rescued. So, in the end, the battle turned out about the way I expected. in terms of the resolution. However, I thought this would be a much less interesting battle, although it did turn out to be more complicated than I expected. So, overall rating, Conan 2d20 system, I will give it 3 stars out of 5 for wargaminess being high and ease of play being low. So, thank you very much for listening. Have a great day, and please hit that subscribe button so that you can be alerted to the next episode, Mastering Mass Combat series.